For a long time, I've been fascinated with life inside North Korea, which stems from my interest in the communist past of the country I come from, Belarus. Sometimes I think about what my life would have looked like had I been born even just 1 or 2 decades before I did. But North Korea took the madness of the Soviet Union to a whole other level, and the more you hide something, the more it makes people curious. Now, this is a film-related channel, and I've often thought about making a video on the crazy film industry of North Korea. There are already so many videos about it, but very few people actually know about another side of North Korean cinema, which I'd like to introduce you to: animation. The first thing I immediately noticed when watching old North Korean cartoons was how similar their style was to Soviet animation of the 50s and 60s. It's not surprising to see a lot of Soviet influence, since that's how North Korea was born in the first place, as a puppet state after World War II. Any respectable dictator out there knows that cinema is a great tool to consolidate power and promote their ideology. And the first leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, knew that very well. There was a small film industry in Korea under Japanese occupation, and despite heavy censorship, it was still used as a form of political resistance by some filmmakers. But after Korea was liberated, split into North and South, and devastated by the Korean War in the early 50s, all the film studios were destroyed as a result of this tumultuous time in Korean history. The film industry in the North was rebuilt in the following years, and that's when the first animation studio was also founded, the 26th of April Children's Film Studio, later renamed Scientific Educational Korea, or SEK in short, to make it sound a bit more international. As you might imagine, the focus of these cartoons was to instill the North Korean kids with all the anti-capitalist, pro-communist, and pro-Kim regime rhetoric, which is actually the purpose of literally all media in the country. I'm not sure if SEK is the only animation studio in North Korea, although there are many abroad that are closely connected to the regime, especially in China. But SEK is certainly the biggest one inside the country, and maybe even one of the biggest animation studios in the world. I've consistently come across a figure of 1,500 employees in the studio, out of which around 500 are animators. Keep in mind, though, that this information is from around 20 years ago. These animators were very efficient, so much so that they have even worked, directly or indirectly, with many animation studios abroad. Besides their home-produced projects like Clever Raccoon Dog and Squirrel and Hedgehog, SEK was also responsible for some European productions like The Legend of the Titanic, a movie about Padre Pio, and Christmas in New York. What these three Italian films that I mentioned have in common is that they were all co-produced by Mondo TV, which was recently fined for its direct involvement with North Korea in defiance of international sanctions. But this company is far from being the only one doing that, and it might surprise you that among all the client work of SEK, American Animation was part of it. I have to admit that as far as I'm aware, there is no conclusive information on any American studio directly working with North Korea. But that doesn't take away from the fact that, allegedly, films like The Simpsons movie, Futurama, or series like Avatar: The Last Airbender were worked on partially by artists from SEK. But how did that happen? Well, American studios used to outsource a lot of animation to cheaper labor around the world, and many of them were in Asian countries like China, India, and South Korea. It's possible that the South Koreans subcontracted some of their work to North Korea without their American client being aware of it. Aside from these unofficial collaborations between South and North, the two countries have actually worked together officially before. And one of those projects was an animated feature film called Empress Chung. Directed and in big part self-financed by Nelson Shin, he was born in the North before North Korea even became a thing. He moved to Hollywood, where he worked on many animated projects including the Transformers movie and the Pink Panther show, before going back to South Korea to found his own animation company, ACOM, and help develop their animation industry. Compared to the North, where they were already producing kids' cartoons in the 50s, South Korea's animation industry was only limited to advertising at first. Then it became a great resource for Western studios for outsourcing, and these studios in South Korea would animate very popular series in America like The Simpsons at a much lower cost. But Shin had ambitions for his own projects too, and Empress Chung was one of them. It would be impossible to think that North and South Korea would work together on anything nowadays, let alone an animated film. But in the early 2000s, that actually became a reality thanks to the South's so-called Sunshine Policy, which temporarily improved their relations. This allowed for a few direct collaborations between both countries in animated projects like the kids' TV series Pororo the Little Penguin, as well as Nelson Shin's Empress Chung, based on an old Korean fairy tale. Unfortunately, the film has never been released on any home media, only being screened at a few film festivals around the world and a limited number of film theaters in North and South Korea. Aside from the contributions of SEK to animation worldwide, what is it like to actually work inside the studio? Well, like anything related to North Korea, the information isn't always readily available, but Nelson Shin and French-Canadian animator Guy Delisle provide us with some interesting information based on their own experiences working with the studio and even visiting it in person. Delisle was sent there by the French animation studio he was working with in the early 2000s to supervise the animation on a new TV series. There were other foreign animators working there at the same time from other studios, so it looks like it wasn't uncommon at the time. But none of these people were allowed to work directly with the average animators at the studio, and instead supervised everything through interpreters or North Korean supervisors who were allowed to talk to the foreigners. There is conflicting information on the quality of the animators' work. Nelson Shin and Dominique Beauchamp, the president of a French animation studio that worked with SEK, claim that the artists are excellent, time-efficient, and cost-effective. Guy Delisle, on the other hand, in his graphic novel about his experience at the studio, often shows how he has to teach animators even the basics of animation. But at least everyone can agree that the labor is extremely cheap over there, so cheap that it attracts so many people willing to evade sanctions. According to Beauchamp in an early 2000s article, it was 7 times cheaper than what you could get in France, and even 3 times cheaper than hiring a studio in South Korea. But hold on, isn't it difficult to send money to North Korea? Well, apparently, as Beauchamp says, they like to be paid in euros, deposited in specific channels in Austria and Singapore, but I don't think those were the only ways. Nelson Shin, for example, just used to wire his money directly to SEK when he was working with them on Empress Chung. Communication with the studio was also difficult, but not impossible. Drawings and instructions were usually sent via fax, privileged email, or even just mail. But even with interpreters on the North Korean side, there were still cultural barriers that were hard to break. Some animation is just too out of the ordinary for North Korean animators to understand, and that's where foreign studios are forced to hire artists from regular, non-sanctioned countries. You might think that the sanctions on North Korea made it harder on them to keep evolving and working with the outside world nowadays, but you're dead wrong. They're still working on TV series like Invisible, and also some series from Japan, which was recently leaked by a hacker who easily managed to break into the servers at SEK. It's a shame though that with all the talent that North Korea seems to have, these animators can only work under the strict control of the regime. If they're not making propaganda films for the North Korean children, they're helping drive foreign cash into the country. I wonder how many more films that we all grew up watching were indirectly worked on by North Koreans, but if there's one thing we all learned today, it's that sanctions don't really matter if you work in animation. And with the animation industry being so difficult to break into, especially after graduation nowadays, maybe you should also consider sending your portfolio to our chubby animation fan in North Korea.